Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken. Both Kens. And Jim. Can you hear me? Okay. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here. This is a much larger crowd than I was expecting, and that I was led to believe. I was thinking I might be able to escape sometime in the middle of the talk when things were going bad. I also want to thank Jim for letting me talk about something that has so little to do with the mission of Maine's first ship, or the Bath freight shed, or anything to do with Bath, really. I do have some stuff to say about Maine, just to keep it a little topical. The reason I want to talk about this is I'm writing a book with the tentative title of Global America and How It Got That Way, the United States in Maritime Perspective. In battleships, this is called bracketing. You go for Illustrated History of Maritime Maine, and you go for the world, and now I've set my sights on the US. And I want to start at the beginning, not 500 years ago, which is about when most people think about the start of American history. And I wanted to talk about the people who got here first and who exploited the resources here and who figured out a way to make a maritime life. And they did it all over the country to a degree I don't think people really appreciate, except maybe a handful of archaeologists, most of whom work in a very remote past. And that will be reflected here because I've been reading a lot of their work. As far as I know, no one has ever tried to tell this story in this way. And that's too bad, because if they had, I wouldn't have had to do the work to do it myself. But that's the way the books that I write tend to come into being, is because no one's ever sort of said, well, this is how Lincoln would like to read the story. So you are the either the guinea pigs or the canaries in the coal mine of this project. So bear with me, and many thanks in advance. So this is one of my favorite ideas about the United States. We all talk, particularly now, we're talking about immigrants, and somebody's favorite sandwich has ingredients that none of which come from this world, this hemisphere. And it's important to keep that in mind. Now, this is going to cover a lot of time and a lot of territory, so I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view, as it were, of North American culture areas. I believe this is the Smithsonian's map of North American native culture areas. And we're also going to talk a lot about the Salish Sea, which is a fairly new term for a body of water that straddles British Columbia and Washington State. You can see there, Strait of Juan de Fuca here, Puget Sound down here, this is Washington, this is British Columbia, the Strait of Georgia, Comox, British Columbia is going to feature prominently in a few minutes. So the basic plot of this story begins with people getting to North America at the end of the last ice age, and how they make their way across the continent, especially the United States, and the degree to which they relied on maritime enterprise of various kinds. And how that maritime orientation both shaped the development of various indigenous societies, and how indigenous societies shaped the sea and the rivers and lakes. The narrative, as I said, is based primarily on archaeological sources, with some oral histories thrown in and some early ethnographic accounts, because there is no written history to rely on for this period. But I hope this sketch conveys some of the dynamism and agency of the people who first conquered North America. It's really quite remarkable. So to start at the beginning, this is an area called Beringia. This is the end of the last ice age, really starts in around 20,000 years ago. And as you can see, it's this big sprawling area that straddles Siberia and Alaska and parts of British Columbia. And it's all covered with land you probably wouldn't want to live in, but there were people living there. And their way east was blocked by what's called the Cordilleran ice sheet, which is this thing. Comes down the coast here and along the bottom of Beringia. You can see this is the Aleutian Islands. Here they're sort of a contiguous landmass, and gradually they break up into littler and littler islands. But people lived there. 6,000 years ago, you have a maritime tradition here in the Near Islands, which are the last ones in the U.S. Aleutians. They're called the Near Islands because they're nearest to Russia, who were the people who found it first. And you see, finally, around 10,000, 9,000 years ago, you get Bering Strait kind of opens up and you've got water. But before that, people were just wandering back and forth. There were no borders. There were no walls. So the last ice age began around 100,000 years ago. And that's around the same time that people started, anatomically modern people started coming out of Africa. And people got to Australia by 50,000 years ago at least, and all things being equal, they probably would have gotten here, or their contemporaries would have gotten here to North America around the same time, except for the ice. So, as the ice started to retreat, though, there came into being the current theory, the best theory that I've read, and it's getting more and more validation pretty much every year, is a thing called the kelp highway, which is that people follow the beds of kelp around the southern coast of Beringia, below the ice, or on the ice. There's a thing called the sea ice highway. But the kelp were these incredibly rich forests that were home to, in addition to kelp, which is edible and useful for all sorts of different things, sea mammals, fish, shellfish, tons and tons of life. So if you had access to fresh water and the kelp highway, you're pretty good to go. And this would have offered early on a way of getting from Beringia all the way down past British Columbia, past the Salish Sea and the ice, which basically stops around Puget Sound. So once south of there, the trick is, where do you go from there? And there are basically two options. You can go inland or you can go south. And there is very clear evidence that a lot of people went south. Not a lot, but enough. People landed in a place called Monteverde, Chile, in southern Chile about 14,000 years ago. And closer to home, there is the body of a woman that was found in the Channel Islands off of Santa Barbara from about 13,500 years ago. They could only have gotten there by boat. She could have, and the people she was with. And the boats then were probably made out of rushes or logs. Nothing much more sophisticated than that, probably. Perhaps skin boats, but we just don't know. Because it doesn't survive in the archaeological record. So that's one way of going, and the estimates are that if they, it probably took about 2,500 years, so basically from the time of a little bit earlier than Socrates to the present, to get from Puget Sound down to Chile, which is very fast. And it's too fast to have gone by land, because it's about 32 miles a decade. And we know that 9,000 years after that, there were people migrating across the Russian steppes, and they were only making about 16 miles a year, and the land was already inhabited. So there were people who could show them the way. The alternatives were to go inland into the heart of the continent of the US. And the first way to do that, the really obvious way, is the Columbia River, which starts out here and comes up, and it turns up into Canada, but there are lots of helpful tributaries like the Snake River that lead out of the Rockies and are very close to the Continental Divide. And if you're close to the Continental Divide in Montana, you're close to the headwaters of the Missouri, Mississippi river system. And so you can just drift down, more or less, to the center of the continent. There was a problem, though, and this has to do with problems of actually making the trip and also problems of evidence that people did make the trip. And that was this little thing called Glacial Lake Missoula. And Glacial Lake Missoula is one of my favorite things. I have an uncle who has a house in Idaho, and he told me about it when I was visiting him there for the first time, and he just lit up. Glacial Lake Missoula, if you look it up, there's a YouTube video that describes the whole thing. It's about 20 minutes. It's riveting. Basically, Glacial Lake Missoula was formed by a tongue of ice that came down, blocked up the Fort Clark River, backed up 2,000 feet deep, 1,000 feet above Missoula, and the volume equal to the volume of Lakes Erie and Lake Ontario. And then it kind of warmed up, and the ice dam broke, and the lake drained in perhaps 72 hours. And it's, as I said, this video is riveting. Not only that, they estimate that it did this 3 to 40 times over the course of about 2,000, 3,000 years. So, needless to say, if you've ever been to Eastern Washington, this is all called the scab land. And that's because these floods took 200 feet of topsoil off in an instant. So, hard to prove anything when there's no evidence left. The next alternative, going south on the coast, you get to San Francisco Bay, and there are some nice rivers there, but they go into the Sierra Nevada, and once you're over the Sierra Nevada, you're in the Great Basin, which is an endorheic basin, so all the water flows into the basin, nothing flows out to the sea, and so you get a completely autonomous, unique archaeological system there. The third major way east is to follow the Colorado River up from the Gulf of California, which is right here. And you go up, and there are two significant tributaries. The first one is the Gila, which isn't a terrifically ambitious river, but it goes to within 60 miles of the Rio Grande here, and the Rio Grande takes you into the Gulf of Mexico. And then up here, there's the Gunnison River, and that takes you within 50, 40 miles of the Arkansas River, which takes you right down through the Great Plains to the Mississippi. So, and the possibility that the Gila route was used early on is borne out by the fact that 3 of the oldest archaeological sites in the country are found about 40 miles from Austin, and another one near Tallahassee. So, and those are about 13,000 years old as well. So, while all these things were going on with Glacial Lake Missoula and the ice sheets retreating, the ice sheets had come down along this line. This is the limit of it. You're all sort of familiar with this, and there's Long Island and Cape Cod and the Georges Bank. But it had also come down over all of Michigan and a lot of other Midwestern states, and then it started retreating. But the ice had been 2 miles thick, and when you have something 2 miles thick that's ice, it kind of weighs you down. And so as it melted, it just sort of melted into these depressions. But the Earth is sort of like a mattress, and as the ice was relieved and the water weighs less than the ice did, the land started rising up again. And as a result, first you have this thing called Lake Algonquin, which is this thing that covers most of the 3 easternmost lakes. And then here's sort of early Lake Erie, and here's big Lake Ontario very early on. And you also had the St. Lawrence Valley was very depressed, and all of a sudden the Atlantic just comes rushing in and causes this thing called the Champlain Sea, which is why you can find fossils of sea mammals in the hills of Vermont. Anyway, about 10,000 years go by, or whatever it says on that handout, I'm really terrible with numbers, but look at the handout, you can tell me if the numbers are right. And everything starts draining back the other way, and all of a sudden you can then see the future area of Ottawa and Quebec and Montreal and all those good places. So there's a lot going on physically here. Another thing is that during the Ice Age, of course, the boreal forests had been confined to this tiny, tiny little part of the south of the US. And as the climate warmed up, the boreal forest started expanding northward. And that meant that there were now large trees, very, very larger trees than we can imagine, because we cut down all of the old growth stuff. So there were these enormous trees, and the one that you should really pay most attention to, because we'll come back to it, is birch. Birch starts out here in Alaska, and then it sort of grows that way, but oh, here it is here in this part of the world too. And this raises questions about, well, where were birch bark canoes first built? Were they built here, and did they move east to west to east? Did they start in the middle somewhere and then spread in both directions? We just don't know, again, because there's no evidence. So now all of these changes led to changes in the way that people who were roaming around in small bands acted and lived on the land. And the nice thing about having big trees is you can then have big dugouts. But in order to have dugouts, you need three things. You need two tools. You need something like an adze, a stone adze in this case, called a Dalton adze. You need fire, and fire was easy to come by, but learning how to control it obviously was another thing altogether. And you also needed time. You had to be willing to be somewhat sedentary. And the earliest hunter-gatherers were constantly on the move. And so time became very important. Even a few weeks or a month, you had to be able to stay in one place, forage, feed yourself, feed your community, and take the time to do this. And we've got at least two experiments that have been done on how long it takes to build a dugout canoe. The first one that I came across was, I think, 360 man-hours to build a canoe 16 feet long. Some students did another thing down in Florida, and they came up with about 850 hours to build something a bit longer than that. And we know that there were canoes made up in the Salish Sea area that were 60 feet long, made out of a single log. So you definitely, and those were obviously much later, but you needed a lot of time and patience. So here are the stages of building a canoe. This was taken from the 1588 book by a guy named Thomas Harriot, and John White was the illustrator. You see they used fire to burn the tree down at the base, and then when they burned it down and it was on the ground, then they would use fire to lop off the biggest branches, and then they would put it up on a trestle, and they would lay fire and alternately let it burn, and then douse it with water, and then take a shell or a Dalton adze and chip away the charcoal, and then start the process again until they had the right dimensions and everything was the way they wanted it to be. And this was the way they continued building dugouts for thousands of years, up until the 19th century in some parts of the West. So, and dugout canoes were, in the later period, in the historical period, when people first started recording and writing down what they saw, they were very, very common in the Salish Sea area, and practically everybody had one. William Clark talks about going to a village where there were 52 men, 200 men and 52 boats. Which is pretty much, one for everybody when you consider that these were not all one-man canoes. Most of them probably needed more than one person to control them. Also, what was different about these boats from area to area was the type of wood that they used. So the oldest canoes that we know about are from near Gainesville, Florida. There was literally a fleet of these things found in a place called Noonan's Lake, the oldest of which is 5,000 years old, so 3000 BC. These were made of cottonwood and pine of some sort, I think. And then in the, oh no, that's wrong. Cottonwood was up on the Mississippi, but, and then there was a cedar. Red cedar was used in the Salish Sea area, but red cedar is actually not a cedar, it's a cypress. And a cypress is what they used in Florida. That was a big thing. So the Noonan's Lake ships have been, or boats have been written about, but not terribly extensively. There was an article that came out when they were first discovered around 20 years ago, and there's really been very little done since. So, the one advantage for a sort of fishing, hunting, gathering community is that you can increase your forage radius. So if people could do, forage within a radius of about 6 miles of where they lived or where they were based, canoes enabled you to go up to 12 to 18 miles. So really increased the radius and availability of food. And this had consequences for the way people live, because all of a sudden, if you're going by boat, suddenly you're looking for places that are convenient for boats. So you want places that are relatively clear of places where you can pull your boats ashore, where you can muster goods and people and maybe camp. And so these became the nuclei of settlements in their own right. Also, they're good places for hunting and fishing. And so people would make little improvements to these landings, like putting out, piling up moles, like little docks. They also, in some cases, built canals from a pond to a stream that they wanted easier access to. And because they communicated, boats facilitated communication, they also facilitated trade and, of course, conflict, which is sort of the flip side of that. So these became sort of, in a lot of cases, the nuclei of mound complexes. And mound complexes are things we don't really talk about in American history. I don't remember ever talking about it when I was a kid, or in high school, or in college. But these are the mounds that were known as of 1894, and it's missing a really big one, which is somewhere here in Oklahoma, called Spiro, which our professor here can tell us much more about than I can. Spiro was, I think, discovered in the 1920s or 30s, and it was a major excavation. But you can see here all of these mounds up and down. This is the Mississippi River. This is the Ohio River. These are the sort of rivers of Indiana and so on. And so this is all river-based. And then you also have mounds even down here in Florida. These are very important. This is the Calusa Kingdom, which would sort of flourished around 1500. We have accounts of them from the Spanish. So in any event, mounds were very important. Another thing that we didn't learn in school, because we didn't know until about 5 years ago, or not even, the oldest man-made structures in the Americas, North, Central, South, Caribbean, Arctic, Tierra del Fuego, anywhere, are on the campus of LSU in Baton Rouge. These are the two mounds. They're about 20 feet tall now. They used to be right up against the river, which has moved not too far away. And you can see there in the background is the stadium. And just behind from where I took this picture last month is the enclosure where they keep the LSU tiger. Which I did not see, otherwise I would have superimposed a picture of it on the mounds. Anyway, 9,000 years old. And this is something that, interestingly, we don't talk about it. I was born in New Orleans, I've got family in New Orleans, I've been all over Louisiana. You don't hear much about this, but Huey Long recognized the significance of these in the 1930s when he decided that this should be the centerpiece of the relocated LSU Baton Rouge campus. So there is an understanding that these are important, but they haven't really gotten to the place where they really need to be in the public imagination. This is about an hour or two from, or 2 hours from Baton Rouge. It's in northeast Louisiana. It's called the Poverty Point Complex. It's a World Heritage Site and probably the worst named World Heritage Site in the world. It's inherited its name from a plantation nearby, and the plantation took its name from some impoverished person who moved down from Kentucky in the middle 19th century. So this was erected around 1300 BCE, so 3,300 years ago. This is like around the same time as the Trojan Wars, a little before, just to give you some perspective. You've got the Macon Bayou right here, and Mississippi is about 15 miles away. Again, it was much closer back when this was built. These are ridges. These are about, I forget, a quarter mile long. This mound is, as it says, 660 by 705 feet and 72 feet tall today. What's remarkable is that they did some digging in the last 5 or so years, and they discovered that this mound was built in 3 months. And they didn't have metal tools, they didn't have wheels for wheelbarrows, they had baskets and wooden sticks. And the estimate is that it would have taken 1,000 to 2,500 people 3 months to do this. Now, the permanent population at Poverty Point was minuscule. And of course, they did not have phones and the internet and everything else to sort of get people on the line and say, hey, we're having a party, come over, bring your sticks. So we have absolutely no idea how this was pulled off. But it's the kind of work that we normally associate with agrarian societies with, very strict hierarchies where there's one guy at the top telling everybody at the bottom what to do, as in Egypt, as in the Aztecs, as with the Olmecs. So it's a really fascinating place to go to. I've actually been twice, and the second time I got 5 other historians to go with me, which was really exciting. And some archaeologists, and they had never been. The largest mound complex, again, on a river, is Cahokia, which became the sort of centerpiece of a place called, of a culture area called the Mississippian culture. These are sort of different names of different aspects of it that flourished, rose and flourished and declined at different times. But these were all sort of in the wake or the orbit of Cahokia. And the reason it says circa 1054 is that 1054 is when there was a huge, I forget what it was, either an exploding star. This is the year of the schism in the church. All sorts of things happened all over the world around this time, and it's believed that this was the year of what some people call the Big Bang of Cahokia, which is thought to have transformed the way pretty much everything that followed in the eastern half of the United States unfolded. Not only for the people who lived in its orbit, but also for the people like us who succeeded in the 1500s and beyond. Again, Monk's Mound here is the largest in the country. There were about 85 mounds, give or take. This is in southern, Cahokia is right here, the Mississippi's just to the west, and across the Mississippi is St. Louis. So this is in southern Illinois. Very strategic part of the world. It remains a very strategic part of the world up to the present. And again, it's the centrality of the river system that makes it possible for people to go forth from Cahokia and sort of spread the word, and to also draw people in and draw artifacts in and draw culture in. And there's this great exchange, and it's all happening by the rivers. So in addition to building boats and building mounds and generally having a good time on the water, there are people who actually had to do, work and to eat and so on. And so we make a lot about aquaculture, particularly in Maine. We think we sort of reinvented this incredible thing, or invented this incredible thing of aquaculture. But native peoples were doing this thousands of years ago. This is actually a fairly late development. These are called, these are the Comox fish weirs. Comox, remember, is on the Salish Sea on Vancouver Island. They have estimated that there are 150 to 200,000 stakes from fishing weirs that are lined up still in Comox Harbor if you sort of wander around. Wear shoes because you get splinters. And they were in one of two configurations. They had winged chevrons, and then they had winged hearts. And the winged heart, it's really hard to tell. You have to be very, very devoted to what you're doing as an archaeologist to really pick out the difference, which is why I'm not an archaeologist, among other things. But the basic thing is, the basic design is the same for both. You have a long leader line of stakes, and that pushes or sends the fish one way, and then you've got these wings that sort of keep them from sort of going out and into the big water. And then they lead into these little rectangular or square-ish enclosures, and that's where you then sort of close up this little gate and start scooping them out with dip nets or by hand or whatever it is. For the first 600 or 700 years of Comox, they designed winged heart traps, weirs, that were intended to get shoaling herring. And then probably the climate changed, or at least the fish migration changed, and so about 1300 they started building these winged chevrons, which are pretty much the same, except they have a tiny, tiny little aperture here, because herring are very skittish, and they don't like going into a narrow hole. They'll go into a bigger hole. Salmon don't care. They can go through a thing basically as wide as they are. And so that's the big tell in the difference between these two types. So, but if you think about the labor, even over 1,300 years, to bury 150 to 200,000 stakes for fish weirs, it's just almost inconceivable to me. Now, this is the densest collection of weirs. The oldest is actually not too far away, relatively speaking, from here. It is a weir that was found about 2 years ago by a remote sensing vehicle at a depth of 170 feet. They were exploring caves off the west coast of Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska, and they found a weir, or the remnants of a weir, that they estimate to date from about 11,000 years ago. So people have been modifying the aquatic landscape to increase the fisheries for a very, very long time. And before this place off of Prince of Wales Island was discovered, I believe for a long time the oldest fish weir in the United States was thought to be on Sebasticook Lake in Newport. So, and there are weirs that are even older than one in Alaska found all over the world. So this is it's sort of an example of not the fusion, but of just people coming up with the same solutions to similar problems. Salmon were also a big thing to catch. Obviously, Comox was very involved with that. But the salmon run up the rivers to spawn in usually the fall, sometimes in the spring in California. And there were fish weirs on places like the Columbia River, the Klamath River, where people would try to corral them, and then they would eat them fresh, or they would smoke them and use them over the winter. And because of the importance of fish, and particularly these migrating species, there were all sorts of elaborate rituals attached to the collection of the first salmon, to the erection of weirs, and to things like that. And not all communities or not all tribes observe the same degree of interest in appeasing the the gods, but for a lot of people, salmon were people in the sea who had turned into salmon to come back and to feed the people that they came from. And so if you propitiated them in the correct way, if you take care of them, they'll take care of you. The Kwajalein people on the Salish Sea felt the same way about clams. So those, we haven't even gotten to those people yet. Clam gardens. So clam gardens, as far as I know, only really happened on the Salish Sea. Again, in Vancouver Island is where one of the biggest excavations has been done. In this particular region, they had sort of 32 miles of coastline, 9 miles of clam walls that were built to create these clam gardens. And what they would do is they would go to the low tide line, pile up rocks, and then that would allow or prevent sand and shell and all sorts of other stuff from retreating back into the water. It would build up the clam bed. And a lot of this starts obviously on existing clam beds, but they could also do it on bare rock or rock with very little clam on it. And so they were able to increase the habitat of the clams by 25 to 33%, a quarter to a third. And these were tended generation after generation. And as I said, the Kwajalein felt that if they took care of the clam gardens, the clams would take care of them. So it was a very reciprocal relationship. So then we also have fish enclosures, or what some people call fish ponds. And this is in Calusa. The Calusa Kingdom was the one that the Spanish came up against in southern Florida in the 1500s. This is in the 10,000 Islands off the southwest coast of Florida in the Gulf. And this is one of many, 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 many keys that have been developed to some degree. But this was thought to be the capital of the Calusa Kingdom. And you see here a canal that was dug and demarcated by shells, mounds of shells. These are 2 shell mounds here. And then on either side of this canal, you can see there's a clam garden here, not a clam garden, a fish pond here and a fish pond here. And they worked similarly to fish weirs, or they would actually use weirs to sort of guide the fish into the enclosures and then close them off. And then when they needed fish, they just go down and they get them, like getting lobster out of the tank at the fish market. This was not restricted to Florida or even the coasts, and some other Spanish explorers talk about seeing people up around off the Mississippi who had dug ditches or canals from the river to a lake or a pond to do exactly the same thing. Did anybody read about this stuff when they were in school? So I am doing a service. Okay, good. Thank you. So let's talk about Maine, since we're here. Not this part. I'll let you guys do the English stuff later. So this is mid-coast. Shell middens are a very big deal in Maine. There are 2,000 of them recorded, give or take. And some of them are huge. And these are mostly from around, well, not mostly from the Maritime Archaic period, 2,500 years ago. Some of them go up to fairly recently. But the Maritime Archaic is a really interesting period in maritime history, and in particular Maine maritime history, because there were a group of people who lived here about whom we don't know that much. We're not supposed to call them the red paint people anymore, but if you read about the red paint people in the past, that's who we're talking about now. There are 3 sites, one on Monhegan, one on Nevins, in Nevins, the Nevins Mound, or the Nevins site in Blue Hill, and the Turner Farm in North Haven. And what's fascinating about these, among other things, is the amount of evidence of sword fishing. And what's interesting is that there was lots and lots and lots of cod available, and flounder and sculpin and all sorts of other stuff. And it was there for the taking. And cod get to be pretty big, 130 to 200 pounds, 6 feet, but they're really docile. And as you know from reading about the English getting here, you could lower a basket into the water and pull one up, or 2 or 3. Swordfish, not so much. They bask on the surface in the right environment. It has to be fairly warm. So they're easy to find, but then you get up to them and they're 10 feet long, and they've got 3 feet of that is a razor sharp bill with a sword. And they weigh 1,000 pounds, and they could cut you if they got upset. And to kill them, you have to put a harpoon just behind the dorsal fin. And you have to do this from a boat. And it's not like a Chris Craft. It's either a dugout or a birch bark canoe. We don't know. But it's all a little iffy when you have a plentiful food source, lots of plentiful food sources available to you that are not that. So there is some speculation, and I don't think it's unreasonable, that this was done for prestige more than anything else. Interestingly, much, much later, starting around 500s, 600s AD, you have sword fishing people, the Chumash Indians, again in the Channel Islands and around Santa Barbara, and they also went sword fishing. And either as a result of sword fishing or because it's hard to tell which came first, but they developed a very stratified society at that time. And it's pretty clear from the archaeological evidence. But sword fishing is associated, just as it is today, if you go down and get marlin in Florida, it's something you do for fun more than because you're a subsistence fisherman. Unless you're the old man in the sea, which is totally different. Anyway, the shell middens are really fascinating to me. I didn't know that there were 2,000 shell middens in Maine, and all I knew was, there were a bunch on the Damariscotta River, and most of them were carved up. But the volume of clams involved and the length of time over which these places were occupied is really extraordinary. So if you go to the Indian Island, I think, off of Booth Bay, or near Booth Bay, it's got an enormous, Indian Town Island off of Booth Bay. It was occupied 4 months a year for about 1,700 years, and they estimate that the middens contain 35 million clamshells. So that's a lot. That's about 20,000 a year over 4 months, every year for a very, very long time. So, as I said, there's a question about what kind of boats these people were using, not only for sword fishing or going out and getting cod and anything else, but for trade. And the people of the Maritime Archaic period who were associated with the sword fishing were avid traders. And whether they left to go out and get the trade, or they met people halfway or part of the way, or whether people came to them, were not really clear. But they traded distinctly in 2 different directions. They traded inland as far as Ohio and upstate New York, where they got things in banded slate. And they also traveled to a place called Rama Bay, or they have goods from a place called Rama Bay in northern Newfoundland. And again, I just wanted to sort of remind you that this is the, where did the canoes come from? We don't have any remains of canoes anywhere near this period. I think the oldest are about 1700s, because the materials are all, they just disintegrate. Also, there's a great account given to a Frenchman on Prince Edward Island from about 1740, in which his informant says that this is a Micmac speaking, he says, "We've had our canoes from time immemorial, and they have always been the same as you see now. In the older times, instead of the birch bark we use now, our ancestors used moose skins. And oral tradition is a very interesting subject, and it's obviously, it's got problems, but it also has lots of virtues. In fact, in today's New York Times, there's a fascinating article about Sacagawea and the Hidatsa oral tradition versus the written tradition of illiterates like William Clark, who I forget, but he had some absurd number, like 28 different ways of spelling mosquito, which, you know, I understand is a hard word, but especially if you're trying to kill them as you're writing. In any event, it's just very difficult to know what in the older times this Micmac could have been referring to. Was it, you know, a few generations back? Was it hundreds of years back? Was it thousands of years back? We just, again, don't know. But the fascinating thing about Native American canoes is that they are one of the most successful watercraft in the history of the world. They are supremely popular all over the world. They've been imitated in every material known to man. And they are used in the Olympics. They're used in all kinds of different ways. And of course, no Native American has ever made a nickel off of this, but it really testifies to the genius of the form and the shape and the ingenuity that went into this, and into building them. And again, the Micmac, we know from direct observation by people who wrote it down, that Micmac were trading by sea in canoes from Nova Scotia down, I believe, to Long Island, or Cape Cod anyway, around the time that Europeans first got here. So seagoing canoes are not unheard of, so it is perfectly plausible that people could have used those kinds of boats. But again, we just don't really have a good answer to that. To give you an idea of this trade network that I was talking about before, these are the sort of the cemeteries that were the first reason people were called red paint people. And these are the burial sites around Maine, but this is the distance between Rama chert quarries in Canada, northern Newfoundland, down to Penobscot Bay. According to one person, it's 1,000 miles as the crow flies, but Rama Bay chert was not delivered by crows. It was actually delivered by a coastal route that went down the coast of Newfoundland, and then or Labrador, and then along the coast to Quebec, and then jumped across the St. Lawrence at some point, and then it stayed in Quebec, and then into New Brunswick, and from there to Nova Scotia and Maine. So the exact mechanism that was used, the routes, the logistics, we just don't know, but it's clear that there was this trade going on, and it involved a considerable amount of sea travel. So I want to wrap this up more or less where we started, and I apologize for going on so long, but there's a lot I haven't even touched on that I would love to talk about. But the sort of the missing part of this discussion so far is Alaska and the Arctic. And it's very important that we get to know our 51st and 52nd states better. So as I said earlier, the maritime tradition in Alaska starts around 6000 BC in the Aleutian Islands, out in the Near and the Rat Islands here. And the watercraft that is most associated with them is the second, I think, most popular watercraft is the kayak. And these were frame first construction skin boats, mostly marine mammals used, not moose skin, as the informant on Prince Edward Island talked about. And there were several bouts of sort of cultural expansion out of this part of the world, out of Alaska. The first is the Arctic small tool tradition, which is about 2500 BC. And then you get the Dorset culture that comes along around 500 BC. And one of the key characteristics of that is that they start using fuel for fire, for heat and light. The Arctic small tool tradition used wood, but the Dorsets began using animal fats. And they would hunt these sea mammals from their kayaks and their umiaks. They had all sorts of elaborate things, including pivoting toggles and so on, and they would have bladders on their harpoon lines to tire out the animals and be able to find them easily and so on. And then the last culture was the Thule culture, which starts about 1,000 years ago, and it explodes from Alaska and it goes sweeping across northern 51st state to the eastern shores of the 52nd state. And what's interesting about this, and the reason I chose this map, is just to give you a sense of the complexity of what's going on in the Americas, in North America, over this whole time that we've been talking, or that I've been talking anyway, that we have 25 language isolates and 32 language families just in North America. And yet these people were still able to develop trade and communication amongst each other, internally, but also with foreigners. And what happens in Alaska is you get the Thule tradition moving so fast that the only difference between what they speak here and what they speak in eastern Greenland is dialect. It's not a different language. It's the same family of languages and the same language, essentially. So as I said, there are many things that I did not touch on: the use of poison for fish, the development of the fish enclosures in Hawaii, which were really fascinating, and I have not forgotten that Hawaii is actually one of our states. Unless you happen to be a president who's born there, in which case it's not really a state. There's so many different things, but I hope I've given you a sense of the vitality and enthusiasm with which the people who first tamed the continent did their work. Thank you.
I have to go a long way back to see all the people. Are there any questions for Lincoln Paine on this topic? Yes, of course.
Can you further describe the mounds? Like, what do you think the meaning or the original, why were they built in the first place? Do you have any ideas?
They were built for different reasons. Some were used for habitation, some were used for ritual purposes, some were used for burials. A lot of shell middens around the country went through a variety of different uses over time. So they could be used for different things. Some of them were built simply for lookouts. I mean, it's one of the reasons you have so many mounds on the Mississippi is because they're strategically placed on elevated parts of the riverbank so that you could see people coming. And in the historic period, there's a lot more about who controlled the central Mississippi. Was it the English? Was it the Spanish? Was it I believe the Choctaw, the Cherokee? And it was really the native people up until about 1809 when they got sold down the river by the federal government.
The next question, you need to repeat it so the Zoom people can hear it. And any other
So
questions?
the question was about what people used mounds for.
Any other questions?
You're
Yes.
talking about a trade route
Yeah.
from like the Maritimes and down along the coast of Maine, but I couldn't hear what products, what they were trading. Was it good?
They were trading, in that particular case, Rama chert, which is a stone. It was highly polished and it was useful, but it was also an exotic. And just as there is today, Bulgari watches or, chert, take your pick.
Yes, any more questions?
Great.
Yeah.